Philip II by William Thomas Walsh. Chapter 4. Philip's First Marriage, 1543. The 3 years after the death of his mother were crucial for Philip. If we could penetrate all their secrets, we might understand that enigma of his character which has puzzled so many historians. Contemporary records are fragmentary and objective, containing little in the way of confessions or self-revelations. Such as they are, they suggest to anyone familiar with the monumental correspondence of his later life that the enigma has been greatly exaggerated. If his character is unusual, it is for qualities directly opposite to those of the English tradition. Far from being a sinister, morose, secretive person, at once bigoted and hypocritical, cowardly and cruel, dilatory and yet enormously active, bureaucratic and yet doing everything himself, a tyrant and yet the slaves of priests and monks, we find emerging from the records of his time a personality of extraordinary simplicity, all of a piece, consistent with itself. There was a canny, childlike quality in Philip, even in his later years. This simplicity so astonished his enemies that they frequently mistook it for subtlety. Inclined to be too trusting by nature, he had it impressed upon him by Charles and Charles's counsellors that nobody could be trusted in that Machiavellian world. Thus there was born in him a conflict which explains many of his hesitations. Affectionate and even sensual in disposition, he accepted with the fervour of a child not only the discipline of the court and the study, but the whole weight of Catholic teaching, which made for the subordination of passion and emotion to intelligence and will. Less fond of action than Charles, he was more patient in judgment, and in the long run more likely to see through the actions and characters of men. Less robust and assertive, for he had inherited something of his mother's delicacy of constitution, he was the victim of a certain nervous instability which he had to learn to control. When anything disturbed or alarmed him, the physical reaction was immediate, indigestion, and after too much violent exercise, a high fever. Later in life, like his father, and most other men past middle age, he suffered from gout, the result of an almost exclusively meat diet, which medical opinion considered healthy. At all periods of his life, sudden anxiety often caused him to have diarrhea. Considering his physical and nervous inheritance and the many sicknesses of his childhood, he was developing very much as Charles wished. His adolescence seems to have been normal. If he differed from other boys of his years, it was in the possession of a more developed sense of responsibility. At 13 he had begun to rule Spain, according to Cabrera, with judgment and divine zeal beyond his years. Everything he did was noted and reported to the emperor in France, in Flanders or Germany. Charles was not foolish enough to abandon his heir to the exclusive society of such weighty personages as the 3 counsellors who talked over the affairs of Spain and of Europe with him every day and undoubtedly helped him form his decisions. Cardinal Tabera, the Duke of Alba, and Secretary Cobos were easily forgotten when there was any good sport in the vicinity. His Highness is very well and improves in everything, wrote Zuniga to the Emperor in January 1540. He pursues his study as when your Majesty was here, and ever since your Majesty's game arrived, he has gone into the country to hunt twice a week, and sometimes goes on Saturdays to Our Lady of Atocha. But even there, if there is news of a hare let loose, he goes to shoot it. A month later, Philip was hunting in the woods near Pardo. He came and went in a litter. On arriving at the famous royal hunting place, he mounted a horse and rode about the mountains for 6 hours, which seemed only 2 to him, but 12 to me, wrote the old soldier to the emperor. He shot 2 arrows, one at a good-sized deer and the other at a herd of hinds, but he missed them both. The first was in a decoy. The next day Philip was to hunt with falcons. This royal sport appealed to him immensely. In March he made some fine shots at partridges, hunting with pointers, and bagged some hares. In May he went to Aranjuez for 4 or 5 days to divert himself, and returned to Madrid for Easter. He is very happy, wrote Zuniga, because during the 2 days he was here there was a hallooing of rabbits, and he killed more than 20, and 2 or 3 hares. Another day he killed 2 bucks, wherewith he was the most pleased person ever seen. He laughed at me because of a dead hare that he had set for me to aim at. When I hit it, I was pleased, even though it was dead. Meanwhile, the patient Silizio, who was both confessor and schoolmaster, was getting results. Just before Philip was 13, at an age when American boys are just beginning to study Latin, he was greatly advanced, and within half a year will be able to read by himself all the historians who have ever written, no matter how difficult they are, at least with slight aid from a master, wrote the tutor to the emperor. In speaking Latin, he has improved sufficiently, for he has spoken no other tongue in all the time he has studied, and practice will give him facility in speech, as much or more than teaching. He has commenced to write Latin, and I have hopes that he will master it very well. This was in March 1540, after Philip had studied Latin for 4 years. It was at that time that Silizio took him to hear some of the famous lectures at Alcalá de Henares, and your majesty can believe, he reported, that he understood them all, except the one who read Hebrew, and rejoiced so much in hearing and understanding what they said that it was no labour to him any of the time he listened, which was over 3 hours. In health he is very well, thank God, and very gay, alegre, for he enjoys the days of hunting, which your majesty commanded be given to him. Your majesty can believe that he gives evidence and hope to all who converse with him that he will be such a servant of God and wise king as the kingdom has need of, and your majesty desires. There was another favourable report from Silizio on June 22nd. The prince was advancing daily in learning and desire for letters, and I assure you that although the thing he likes best now is hunting, he does not on this account neglect his studies at a particle. Well it is that in this his 14th year, when nature commences to be conscious of frailties, God has given the prince so much interest in the chase and in studies. That was in 1540, the year of the hot summer. The drought was so severe that in some parts of Europe the parched forest took fire spontaneously. The city of Nain in Gascony burst into flames and perished. People were dying of disease and famine in northern Europe. On the following Easter Sunday, 1541, Philip received his first Holy Communion. On the same day, as a symbol that he had attained the mature age of 14, he appeared for the first time dressed in brilliant colours and wearing ornaments of gold. He continued to follow the incredible journeys and labours of his illustrious father with keen interest. Now and then a courier brought a letter full of wise and cautious advice about men and the ways of government. Charles had arrived in Ghent at the beginning of 1540, after a magnificent progress through France as the guest of his sister Eleanor and of his new friend Francis I. He met his other sister, Mary of Hungary, regent of the Low Countries, at Valenciennes, January 21st, and with her a deputation from Ghent, to whom he expressed his mounting anger, saying he had come in the dead of winter at great inconvenience, and meant to make an example of them. It was enough that they had caused the failure of the siege of Terouenne by refusing the subsidy that all the rest of the Netherlands had agreed to, and persuading others to refuse. What was worse, officials had publicly torn to pieces the famous calfskin and given shreds to mobs to wear in their hats. Charles was most deeply moved when he discovered that the real objective of the secret fomenters of the rebellion was not freedom from taxation, for he had scrupulously observed local privileges and was exceedingly popular throughout Flanders, but the injury of the Catholic faith. It is interesting to notice that this revolution follows the modern anti-Christian pattern. It begins among a few rich intellectuals who complain about some political injustice. The poor are induced by propaganda or other means to make demonstrations in the name of liberty. Political authority is broken down, and then with sinister swiftness, the guiding spirits direct the popular wrath against the church. In the revolt at Ghent, as Armstrong sensibly observes, there was now a strong religious and socialist element. It is said that a day was fixed for the plunder of the rich, the monasteries, and the churches. The revolutionists fondly imagined that they could carry all Flanders with them, and then, perhaps, with the aid of France and the German Protestants, throw off the sovereignty of Charles. Charles entered the city without resistance on February 14th, and with a great burst of pageantry to impress the people. Besides the chief nobles of the Netherlands and the regular cavalry of Flanders, he took with him 3,000 German Landsknechts. The well-armed guilds had built fortifications and exacted contributions from religious, but did not attempt to resist the emperor. The leaders of the revolution were promptly arrested, tried and condemned, and 9 were beheaded on the spot where one of Charles's magistrates had been put to death. The town was deprived of its privileges and sentenced to pay an indemnity of 150,000 gulden, which Charles later reduced almost by half. On the 3rd of May, the rest of the sentence was carried out. The magistrates and their burgesses appeared before the emperor bareheaded, in black robes, girt with ropes, to pray for mercy, and after them 50 of the Guild of Weavers, 6 of each of the 53 lesser guilds, and 50 of the revolutionary party known as the creasers, criers, in shirts, with ropes around their necks. Charles, after seeming to hesitate, yielded to Mary's request for mercy. His authority in the Netherlands was safe. That was all he really cared about. Meanwhile, the friendship of Francis I was wearing as thin as Charles might have expected, had he been less anxious for it. His most Christian Majesty was intriguing anew with Lutheran princes to prevent the reconciliation of Germany at the Diet of Ratisbon. In July of that year, 1540, he definitely ended the hope of a solid peace with the emperor and peace for Europe by marrying the child Jeanne d'Albret against the wishes of her own parents to the Duke of Cleves, enemy of Charles and brother of Henry VIII's third wife. Up to that time, Charles had been willing to give the Infanta Maria to the Duke of Orleans, with the Netherlands for a dowry, if Francis would relinquish his claim to Milan and Savoy and aid the Catholic cause against Turks and Lutherans. This the smiling Valois refused to do. What was the title to the Low Countries but a shadow, he cried, if Maria had no children? He found support here in Ferdinand, Charles's brother, King of the Romans, who wanted Maria for his own son Maximilian, with the hope that if Philip died, and he was none too robust, Spain and even the Empire might come into the hands of the younger branch of the Habsburgs. Be it so, said Charles, when he learned what Francis had done, but he was much disappointed. His only hope of a Christendom united against the Turk had almost vanished. With Francis secretly preparing to betray him again, and the Turk planning a great offensive in the east, Charles attempted at the Diet of Ratisbon to conciliate the German Protestants without sacrificing the Catholic faith. An impossible task, as it proved, but one so near his heart that he attended the conferences at Regensburg, April 1541, in person, and had a compromise drawn up in such phraseology that both parties imagined it confirmed their view of justification. Rome rejected it, and Rome, of course, was right as usual. When Amsdorf, friend of Luther, accused Charles of insincerity, the emperor called upon God to witness that he meant to begin a reform of the church, even without the consent of the Pope, if the Estates would help him. It was plain, however, that the Protestants did not mean to cooperate in a general council, without which there could be no reform, and that no agreement could be reached between Catholics and Protestants without the submission of the latter to the authority of the one indivisible church. The papal legate, Contarini, Venetian scholar and gentleman, friend of reform and of conciliation so far as that was compatible with the faith, urged Charles in despair to employ his authority against the heretics. Charles replied that he was no theologian, but understood the quarrel on the Blessed Sacrament to be only over the word transubstantiation. Contarini, who was a theologian, knew better than the emperor that men's actions and the destinies of kingdoms depended upon ideas, and ideas upon definitions. Thus, in England, the attack on the word transubstantiation was merely the first skirmish against the Eucharist itself, that is to say, in the long run, against Christ. The conference failed. There were many who agreed with Granvelle that all Germany, Italy, and France might soon be lost to the Church. Charles had accomplished nothing for the faith. In fact, he had given a new advantage to the Protestants. In the political field, that is, for his own interests, he managed to win over, for the first time being, two of the chief heretic princes, Joachim II and Philip of Hesse. He purchased the aid of Joachim against France by permitting the latter's new church government on the Tudor model to remain until a general council or a diet should decide otherwise, thereby seeming to countenance the favourite thesis of heretics that the council was superior to the Pope. In making a secret compact with the lustful Philip of Hesse, whereby he assumed him immunity for all his previous illegal acts, Charles condoned his bigamy, even as Luther had condoned it. Thus Charles, desperately eager to cover his rear from attack by the Lutherans or the French, while he thrust back the Turk, gained a temporary advantage at the expense of the Church's true interests, thinking of himself all the while as her one faithful champion and protector. He was now free to carry out his long-deferred crusade against Algiers, and incidentally, while cleaning up that nest of pirates, to add to his own dominions. As the Diet, a complete failure, came to its dismal close, all Christendom was in dreadful peril. On July 29th, just 2 months after the Protestant leaders had laughed at the danger, saying they had more faith in Turks than in Christians, Suleiman smashed the army of Ferdinand, took Budapest, thereafter to be a Mohammedan stronghold for 145 years, and made its famous Catholic cathedral into a mosque. The Grand Turk was now master of all the country from the Danube to the Theiss. There was terror at Vienna and at Rome. Cardinal Aleander was not alone in fearing that all Europe would be conquered by the Muslims, while Luther thundered at the Pope, and his agents quibbled over doctrines. Charles, prevented by the German division from meeting the foe in the east, decided to cause a diversion by striking again in Africa. Sending out hasty orders for the mobilization of troops and ships in Italy, he hurried by way of Trent and the Brenner to Milan, then to Genoa, then, September 10th, to Lucca, to confer with Pope Paul III. The Holy Father agreed to call a general council at Trent. This might enlist the cooperation of any Protestants who sincerely sought to reform the Church, and not its destruction, and would tend to keep peace in Germany until Charles returned. Of the Algerian expedition, Paul had small hopes. He warned the emperor that heavy storms were to be expected in the autumn. Charles knew better. He set sail with his galleys September 28, 1541. This too, in spite of the advice of the old sea dog, Andrea Doria, who feared not only the tempests, but a counterattack by the Turks, perhaps in Italy, and had heard that the French garrisons in Piedmont were being increased. Charles was confident that he could seize the pirate base in 2 weeks, while Barbarossa was still in the east. The chance seemed worth taking. If successful, it would prevent the Franco-Turkish naval alliance for which Francis was already arranging, and it might force Suleiman to return to Constantinople. Thus Charles rushed headlong into his first great disaster. There were delays of subordinates upon which he had not counted. Doria had been right about the weather. When the Spanish and German tercios landed on October 4th, the sky was overcast and a heavy sea running. They had hardly established their camp before Algiers, when night came rushing down upon them with howling winds and a savage pelting of rain and hail, until their tents were blown away and they were left soaked and muddy in the inky darkness. Just before dawn, the renegade Hassim Aga sallied forth from the town to attack them. The Spaniards stood like a rock, but the Italians broke under the furious assault. The defeat might have turned into annihilation if Charles himself, fighting sword in hand in the front ranks, as his grandfather Ferdinand had fought, had not given a superb exhibition of courage and calmness that steadied his ranks until the enemy retired. When thunder and lightning ushered in the fearful dawn, he saw that 14 of his great galleys and 100 smaller ships had been smashed or driven on the rocks. It was useless to continue at that season. After one more thrust at Metafus, Charles returned to Europe to face the mockery of his enemies. Philip, who had thought his father an unconquerable hero, must have been hit hard by the blow. But he rose to the occasion and wrote a letter of consolation which is quoted in part, without revision of the bad constructions and obscure or awkward phrasing which mingle so grotesquely with its bombastic Renaissance periods and sententious aphorisms, suggesting the copybook, and perhaps the advice of Dr. Silizio, and disposing of Hume's objection that it did not seem to be the work of a boy of 14. "Consider," wrote Philip to his father, "that returning from difficult enterprises without victory does not rob kings and great captains of the meed of their valour, and the one who loses by force of fortune ought to be more consoled, for against his prudence and greatness with all the elements conspires. Nor is it ever good to trouble oneself over events. Let each one perform what has been allotted to him, for if he ordained things well, he laboured successfully." The emperor had done his best in a just cause, and was not responsible for the vagaries of fortune. When Charles returned to Spain, prematurely old and tired of the world, he was still clinging, apparently, to the notion that he might make a second attempt at Algiers. At least it was so reported in England. Henry VIII took it upon himself to offer some wholesome advice, which was duly forwarded by Chapuis. He thought that, instead of going to Africa, Charles should send only a small fleet there. This would be a good excuse to get a large sum of money from the Cortes of Castile, always generous where the defence of Christendom was concerned. It was Henry's idea that the emperor should then go to Flanders. In his absence, he ought to leave a number of notable councillors, part of whom ought by no means to be natives of Spain, to surround the prince's person, on condition that neither the prince nor his council should conclude anything important without his consent or imperial seal. The prince ought to have, besides a bodyguard of his own, a good number of gentlemen attached to his person, and a division of regular troops to defend him against the insolence of the Spanish grandees, keeping them in order and subjection, and should any of these latter raise his head, have him punished at once. Furthermore, to prevent a plot to raise the prince to the throne and exclude the emperor, the latter should take his own mother, Joanna the Mad, secretly to Flanders. Joanna was still, technically, the legitimate ruler of Spain. Henry's motives in offering this curious advice are not clear. Had he reason to believe that a plot was being formed to cripple the royal power of Spain by the old expedient of raising up an immature boy controlled by crafty and greedy men against his father? Or did he hope, by wakening Charles's suspicions of his own nobles and drawing him away from Spain, to have Protestant influence introduced there from Flanders? Or was he merely following his new policy of cultivating Spain as his relations with France cooled? He had been formally deposed by Paul III in 1539 after the desecration of the shrine at Canterbury. Nevertheless, he seemed more eager to be considered Catholic after he had Cromwell beheaded in 1540 for attempting to convert him to Lutheranism, it was reported in Spain. Or did Henry merely hope that Charles would stop in England and see him on his way to Brussels? This last was the emperor's conjecture. He thanked his brother, he had reluctantly given up calling him our beloved uncle at the urging of the tactful Chapuis, and assured him there was no real danger in Spain. Charles never saw far enough beneath the surface of events. There were many dangers in his court, close to his person, that he took no notice of. Circumstances perhaps left him too little time for reflection. He was always going on long perilous journeys, in desperate need of money, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, and doing his best for God and for Spain, often with bad results for both. At this juncture he was saved the trouble of deciding what to do by Francis I, who took advantage of his plight after Algiers to launch a new war against him, this time on several fronts, and on such a scale that the safety of Christendom itself seemed to have been tossed upon the altar of French perfidy and revenge. In the hot July of 1542, when swarms of locusts devoured the vegetation in all parts of Europe and reminded the learned of the plagues of Egypt, Francis struck at the Netherlands, invading Artois and Flanders in the hopes that the anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish factions at Ghent and Antwerp would rise up again in rebellion. Simultaneously he thrust at Perpignan, capital of Roussillon, and at Luxembourg. The Protestant Duke of Cleves helped him in the north. In the east, Soliman was preparing a new fleet to send against Italy, with the French ambassador on board. Young Philip, like every normal boy, must have dreamed of going to the wars and performing great deeds of valour. Now he had his opportunity. Armoured from head to foot, he rode over the northern hills towards the French border with the Duke of Alba, at the head of the flower of the Spanish army, the best in the world. They fortified themselves in Perpignan, and defended themselves so gallantly that the French Dauphin was forced at last to give up the siege and retire. Don Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, Duke of Alba, was already, at the age of 34, he was 8 years younger than Charles, one of the 2 or 3 best soldiers of Europe. At 17 he had distinguished himself on the bloody field of Pavia. He had been in important command at Tunis in 1535. His brilliant defence of Perpignan confirmed the emperor's belief that a great military genius had come upon the stage of history. In fact, Charles considered him second only to himself. Don Fernando was dark but not swarthy, with black curly hair, well set up with a long Castilian face, fine eyes of rather light brown, with brows close above, an aristocratic nose, and a somewhat melancholy mouth that could easily become stern or compassionate, with straggly black mustachios drooping over the corners of it. Courteous but outspoken, he had already attained a high place in the political councils of Charles, as he would henceforth for some time be the right arm and half the brain of Philip. Useless bloodshed he abhorred. War to him was a fascinating intellectual exercise, in which the pleasure consisted in seeing how quickly and how safely one could accomplish a certain task for the glory of God and one's king, meanwhile killing as many of the enemy as need be, and losing as few of one's own troops as possible. Stern though he was just. His soldiers would die for a look of approval from him. The presence of Alba, silent, contained, austere, had that mysterious effect upon masses of men that Caesar's had had, and Napoleon's would have, and Kitchener's. He was one of the conquerors. Victory seemed like a dog at his heels. The next year was critical for Philip, for Charles, for Spain, and for Christendom. The storm of hate conjured up by Francis I now burst over them with all its madness. While Suleiman took the field in person to attack Vienna, Barbarossa, with 110 galleys, was ravaging the coasts of Naples and Tuscany, slaying, burning homes and churches, dragging off Christian women and children into slavery. Then, with the envoy of Francis on board, they appeared at the mouth of the Tiber. The French commissary, however, announced that papal territory would not be harmed, and the Turks refrained from sacking Rome, a circumstance which caused some of Charles's friends to suspect an understanding between Francis, the Turks, and the Pope. At any rate, the fleet proceeded to Nice, where the Duke of Savoy had taken refuge, bombarded the place, and found winter quarters in the friendly French port of Toulon. The cry of Christendom, as Hume says, rose loud against the hideous coalition. Even the Lutherans were so disgusted at the treachery of Francis that they gave help to Charles, particularly when his agents magnified his disagreements with the Pope and, it is to be feared, held forth hope of a new schism in which the Emperor would emulate Henry VIII in Germany and set up a state church. Unquestionably, Charles was walking over pretty thin ice, spiritually, during this year. He was beset by foes and driven almost to despair for lack of money. The alliance he was forming with Henry, as a counterfoil to Francis, was even worse, if possible, in the eyes of the Catholics, than the French understanding with the Turk. Pilate was bad enough, but Judas Iscariot. Charles, stung by criticism, felt the need of having his agents in Rome explain that he was supporting Henry only against the French and the Turks, not against the Holy See. He might even bring the schismatic king back into the fold. To offset the whisperings of the French party, who were stronger than the Spanish in the Sacred College, Juan de Vega showed the Pope a letter of Francis I, angling for the friendship of the Landgrave of Hesse with the bait of immunity for Protestantism in Luxembourg. There was a heated argument in the consistory on December 19th, when Paul told the Cardinal of Burgos that the alliance with Henry was worse than that with the Turks. Actually, the Farnese Pope was trying to maintain his neutrality between the two great Christian powers, and succeeded. What Charles wanted was not neutrality, but the Pope's aid against France. When Paul wrote him, urging peace, he replied hotly that peace was impossible with a handful of Italian soil in French hands. It was hardly to be expected that he should see the problem from the larger point of view of the Pope. Paul had another reason for refusing to declare against Francis. He actually feared that this Machiavellian, this unscrupulous fornicator, who, like Henry VIII, was already rotting with syphilis, would apostatize, seize all the church property in France, and, as the Pope warned Charles, become so much more powerful against Spain. The example of the King of England was only too painfully fresh. Ecclesiastical penalties, even excommunication, had failed to bring Henry back to the right way. Would they be more successful with Francis? Paul doubted. The Pope was then 75 years old, a stooped and wizened little shell of a man, whose small, intense, sparkling eyes alone seemed to have survived the wearing out of his frail and sickly body. On his election in 1534, no one had expected him to live more than a year or two, yet he outlasted most of his friends and enemies, and had the longest pontificate of his age. Long ago he had been made a cardinal by Pope Alexander VI. The slanderous gossip of the time, attributing his rise to the influence of his beautiful sister, Julia Farnese, had called him the petticoat cardinal, though his great abilities would have been explanation enough. Paul had lived down all that with the sins of his Renaissance youth. It was after 1513, when he gave up the mistress who had borne him 4 children. One of his bastards was the brutal condottiere Pier Luigi, who brought no end of sorrow on his old age, that he became a priest. After he had said his first Mass on Christmas Day 1519, there was never a hint of scandal in his life for the foulest enemies of the Church to scatter and exaggerate. A whole generation of men had passed away, and Paul, who had learned to control even his hot temper with the will of steel that speaks forth from Titian's portrait, was making his own soul in patience and striving, like his namesake of Tarsus, to expiate his early mistakes. That he had delayed the needed reform of the Church, as Charles alleged, can hardly be denied, but the historians who have been so liberal with their contempt have overlooked the difficulties of his task. When the emperor renewed his plea for a general council in 1541, the Germans refused to consider any place in France. The German towns were too Protestant to please the Catholics, and too cold for the aging Pope to visit. Only Italy was left, but the Germans were opposed to Milan, and the French to Ferrara and Bologna. Mantua, an imperial city not too far from Germany, seemed the best compromise. But when Paul asked both the Emperor and the King of France to allow cardinals to come to Rome, December 1541, to make plans for the council, Francis refused. Meanwhile, the nuncios of Paul were preparing sentiment for the council in various parts of Europe. Curiously enough, the greatest opposition was found in those countries where the clamour for reform was loudest. When Paul at last yielded to German preferences as the lesser of two evils and summoned a council to meet in Trent at the beginning of November 1542, Francis I, then completing his preparation for a new attack on the emperor, refused to receive the papal bull or to allow it to be published in France. His subjects, he said, would not be safe in Trent. The Protestants likewise ridiculed the announcement. They would have nothing to do with Rome. There was no longer any hope of holding a council until after the war between France and Spain. Charles blamed the Pope. Tormented by gout, he could see nothing but the menace of French violence and trickery to his dominions, and, as he thought, to Christendom. His anger carried him so far as a veiled threat to sack Rome again if Paul did not join him against Francis. "The Vicar of Christ," he wrote bitterly, "who has received so many benefits at our hands, is ready to join forces with the King of France, or rather, we should say, with the Turk. He may well look to it that we do not deal the same measure to him that we dealt to Clement VII. Leaving the Pope this threat to think about, Charles hurried from Italy to the Low Countries to repel the invasion there. Never again would he return to Spain as its king. Philip, now 16, was made regent, with an able council to advise him. It had been decided that he was to marry that year. The emperor and others had urged him to choose Marguerite Valois, vivacious daughter of Francis I, as a step towards the conciliation of France, while his sister Maria, if the French agreed, would marry the Duke of Orleans, with the Low Countries as her dowry. The alternative for Philip would be to marry the eldest daughter of his uncle Ferdinand. The emperor sent his secretary Alonso de Idiquez to Spain post-haste to learn the wishes of the prince and the infanta. Philip had ideas of his own, and they were not those of his father. He refused to marry Madama Margarita, as she was called in Spain. He intended to marry his cousin, Maria, Infanta of Portugal, and no one else. Not only that, he pointed out to the emperor the weakness of the policy he suggested. It was vital to Spain and to the empire to keep both Milan and the Netherlands. Without Milan, Spain could hardly hope to keep France out of Italy, and Milan was a vital link in her line of communications by land with her possessions in the north. As for these latter, it would be suicidal to give the Netherlands to France. Flanders was the key position on the Plaza de Europa, a curb on France or Germany in Italy and Spain, a shield against England, Germany and France, an indispensable base by land and sea for any European war. It would be far better, Philip wrote his father, to have Maria marry her cousin Maximilian, son of Ferdinand. Thus the House of Austria would keep all its possessions intact. Charles was satisfied with this reasoning, says Cabrera. It was agreed that Philip should marry his cousin at once, and that his sister should become the bride of Maximilian somewhat later. A gorgeous future seemed to open before young Philip. He had every reason to expect that he would rule not only Spain and its western world, not only the Netherlands and the other estates of the House of Burgundy, not only the strategic parts of Italy and all of Germany, both Catholic and Protestant, but the younger branch of the House of Austria would be kept subservient to him by making his young cousin Maximilian his brother-in-law as well, and if the succession failed in Portugal, he or his son would succeed to its throne and rule the whole peninsula. France would be encircled, England isolated. The vision of a Europe dominated by Spain, and therefore thoroughly Catholic, rose up before him. Was it Philip's own idea to keep Milan and the Netherlands? Since he clung to it and acted upon it unwaveringly to the very end of his long life, it is interesting to find him voicing it so positively at 16. The Duke of Alba, as well as Secretary Cobos, vigorously opposed the alienation of Milan a year later, giving reasons similar to those attributed to Philip by Cabrera. Was the prince merely expressing their views at this time against his father's? This seems likely, considering his age. On the other hand, Charles had taken precautions on leaving Spain against his son's being influenced. He had left Philip 2 letters of advice in 1543, one of them for discussion with the council, but the other so secret that not even Philip's wife must be allowed a glimpse of it. "Since we are all mortal, and God might take you to himself," wrote the emperor, "put the document in such safe keeping that it may be returned under seal to me or burned in your presence." This letter, so revealing of the mind and policies of Charles at the crux of his reign, was written in Palamos, halfway between Perpignan and Barcelona, May 4th and May 6th, 1543. But like his memoirs, it remained hidden until the 19th century. Philip did not burn it, that much is certain. It is not so clear that he disobeyed his father, as historians have assumed, for there is no proof that he did not return it sealed. At any rate, the paper survived. Philip was to have much more power as regent than Henry VIII had suggested for him. His decision was to be final on all subjects, though he was to consider well the advice of his father's wisest counsellors and be guided by it if it seemed good. To aid him in his decisions, Charles gave the boy a brief but penetrating analysis of each counsellor. Quarrels and factions among the ministers were to be discouraged. Nevertheless, they existed. Charles had placed the leaders of the 2 principal cliques at the head of the council, so that Philip might play off one against the other, and thus avoid falling into the clutches of either. Both would try to monopolize him. One of them, the Cardinal Toledo, Tabera, was to be sure a holy man who would give good and unprejudiced advice, which Philip would find useful in selecting candidates for office. But as for the rest, do not place yourself in his hands alone, neither now nor at any time, nor indeed in those of any other man. Rather, discuss business with many counsellors, and do not tie or pledge yourself to one, for though it saves trouble, it is not expedient, especially now that you are beginning your career, for men will say that you are governed, perhaps even without truth, and the minister who gained the credit for it would so lose his head and puff himself up that he would make 1,000 blunders, and all the rest would grumble in the end. Cobos, head of the opposing faction, was the chief finance minister, faithful and honest, and until recently without partisan bias. But the emperor feared this might no longer be true. Old and often in physical misery, he was not so industrious as formerly. His wife wearied and excited him. She had injured his reputation somewhat by accepting gifts. They were of small value, however, and no doubt Cobos would put an end to the abuse, since Charles had mentioned it to him. Cobos knew all the emperor's business intimately, and no one would serve Philip better, if it pleased God that the causes above mentioned should not taint the mother's milk in his character. Philip should support him against the opposition, but should not let him go beyond his instructions. Like all the others, he would try to gain the exclusive favour of Philip. And as he himself had been given to lechery in younger days, he would, if Philip showed any bent in that direction, rather help than hinder, as a means of getting the prince into his power. He had been well rewarded by Charles. If he sometimes hinted at a desire for further emoluments, Philip should treat him seriously and with all respect, and assure him that the emperor would have done more, but for the fear of making others discontented. The great Alba would have been astonished if he could have looked over the young regent's shoulder while he read these instructions. The duke, said Charles, though nearer to Cobos than to the cardinal, was not in the inner circle of government, but he would like to be. However, I do not think that he would have followed either party, but that which best suited his interests. But as it concerns the interior government of the kingdom, in which it is not advisable that grandees be employed, I would not appoint him, and he is much aggrieved over it. Since he has been near me, I have noticed that he thinks to advance himself to great things, as much as he can, although he comes in blessing himself, very humble and modest. You have to guard against admitting him or other grandee very far in the government, for you will find that he and the rest will try to gain your will by all possible means, which afterwards will cost you dear, and I see that he will not fail to tempt you, even though by means of women, of which I beg you to be much on your guard. Make use of him in war and in foreign affairs, for in this he is the best man we have." Zuniga, said the emperor, was absolutely trustworthy, and if he sometimes seemed harsh to Philip, it was his great love that moved him. "There is nothing especially to blame in you, thanks be to God, but there is room for improvement, if you aim at being perfect, as I beg you to do. If Don Juan had been like your other attendants, all would have gone according to your wish, and that is not good for anyone, not even for the old, and much less for boys, who cannot have the knowledge and self-control that experience and age alone can give." Even Zuniga had his faults. He was inclined to lose his temper, especially with Alba and Cobos and others of the opposite party, whom he blamed for a fancied lack of advancement. He was a little avaricious too, but that was the fault of his wife and children, who egged him on. Nevertheless, he was absolutely honest. Philip was to trust him in all matters pertaining to his personal conduct. Even in his marital relations, he was to be guided by the advice of the wise Don Juan, lest he come to the sorry end of Charles's uncle, Prince Juan of the Asturias, whose death at the age of 19 was believed to have been the result of overindulgence with his young wife, on which account, added the emperor a little sardonically, I came to be heir of these kingdoms. As for Silizio, who had just been made Bishop of Cartagena through Philip's favour, he had been too anxious to please the prince, and the emperor hoped it was not for personal reasons. If he was to be the prince's chaplain, it might be well to have a good friar as confessor, for Silizio might be too lenient. Thus far no great harm had been done, but there might be in the future. The soul was the important thing, and should be kept good and pure, especially in youth. The Cardinal of Seville was an excellent and holy man, but broken in health. He should be allowed to retire to his diocese, if he desired. Watch out for the Count of Osorio, artful, clever, not as honest as he might be. Granvelle was a typical Burgundian, with a strong attachment to his own country, and wished to enrich his sons. But he was capable and faithful, should be employed in all matters concerning Germany, Italy, France, and England, and ought to be a member of the Council of Flanders, above all things. His son, the Bishop of Arras, would probably make an excellent successor to his father. For the rest, Philip was urged to be faithful to his wife and to continue his studies even after marriage, especially in languages, which would help him to know and understand the scattered lands he must rule. "To be a man," wrote the emperor, "does not consist in believing that we are one and desiring to be one, nor in being large of body, but solely in having much discernment and reason to perform the works of the man who is good, intelligent, and honoured." Armed with this wise advice from such a source, Philip set out to rule Spain. Just how much he ruled, and how much he was influenced by the councillors in spite of the emperor's warnings, must remain a question. He had his way in the matters of the Portuguese marriage, to be sure, but there remains the possibility that the emperor was influenced quite as much by Maria's enormous dowry, which freed him from his acute financial stress, as by the arguments of the prince. At all events, it was agreed that Philip was to marry Maria Manuela. A papal dispensation was obtained, and preparations were made in both kingdoms. The dispensation was doubly necessary. Maria's father, Juan III, was mother to Philip's brother. Her mother was sister to his father. Political exigency had made inbreeding a custom in the royal families of Spain and Portugal for more than a century. Ferdinand and Isabel were related within the degrees forbidden by the Church. Charles V and his wife were first cousins, but Philip was resolved to marry one who was twice his first cousin, and marry her he did. All the ancient punctilios of Castilian court etiquette were observed before the ceremony. While Maria rode in a litter at the head of a magnificent procession towards the Spanish border, Philip departed on horseback from the beautiful gardens of the Duke of Alba at the Abadia, and cantered over the winding hills to Salamanca. Everywhere, the towns and villages were draped with rich and gaudy colours in honour of the bridegroom, and music followed him wherever he went. Meanwhile, a great cortege of nobles had ridden to the border to meet the princess with musicians, 8 Indians with large round silver shields, 3 noted jugglers, and a dwarf. Donna Maria, at the head of a procession in which even the mules were draped with velvet, embroidered with arms and devices in gold, arrived at Elvas late in October. Couriers dashed back and forth. When the two glittering hosts had come within sight of each other, a dispute arose over some matter of precedence, and the Portuguese cavaliers threatened to take the princess back to Lisbon until Bishop Silicio arranged a compromise. While the Castilians massed on one side of the border and the Portuguese on the other, the bride was carried across a bridge in a litter. Maria won the love of the Castilians at once. She was not large in body and muy hermosa. The people found her very beautiful and genteel. She was just 16 years and 20 days old, and so 5 months younger than Philip. Her portrait suggests that she was probably pretty rather than beautiful. Her mouth was rather too narrow, her chin slightly retreating, her eyebrows high and arched, the whole expression nervous, petulant, lacking in vitality and force. She was in white satin, fretted with gold. Over her gown, to the delight of her future subjects, she wore a long Castilian mantle of mulberry-coloured velvet. Thus, in great magnificence, and with much joyful music and horseplay, she entered Badajoz. Philip had already arrived in disguise. He was waiting somewhere along the road of march for a first glimpse of his bride. As he has left no record of his feelings, one can only conjecture how romantic they were from the fact that he followed the princess all the way from Badajoz to Salamanca, incognito, now dashing along the street of a town to see her face as she passed, now watching from the window of a house or an inn. The journey was made in short stages to avoid wearying the princess, and every day there was some spectacle or feast to entertain her. When she entered Salamanca in a gown of silver cloth worked with gold, and a jaunty blue bonnet studded with gold and surmounted by a white plume, she learned that Philip was somewhere about, and that he meant to get a good view of her from the house of Dr. Olivares. As she passed the house, she covered her face with her fan, but Perico de Santibos, famous juggler of the Count of Benavente, pushed the fan aside so that the prince could see, no doubt to the huge delight of the roaring crowd. When the princess went to the houses of Luso and of Cristobal Juarez, joined by canopies and tapestry walks, Philip stole out of town, still in his disguise, to lodge at the Geronimite monastery nearby. The next day, November 15th, 1543, he made his formal entry by the bridge of Zamora and proceeded to his apartments in the joined houses. After nightfall, the prince and the princess left their separate apartments to go to the salon where the nuptials were to take place. With all the grave ceremony so well understood in Castile, they advanced from the two brilliant groups of personages to meet each other. Philip kissed her hand and embraced her. Then they sat beneath a gorgeous canopy, and the Cardinal of Spain united them in marriage, with the Duke and Duchess of Alba as their padrinos. Music sounded, and a ball began. Both courts danced joyously until 4 o'clock in the morning. Mass was then said, and the Cardinal veiled the bride and the bridegroom, who then retired to their own apartment. For several days the fiestas continued at Salamanca. There were bullfights, juegos de cañas, tourneys, and artificial fires to startle the skies by night. When at last the lovers, for such they apparently became, took their departure for Valladolid, they found every town flamboyant with colour and articulate with music in their honour. They tarried frequently for all manner of feasts and dalliance. On the way they stopped at Tordesillas to visit Philip's grandmother, poor Juana de Loca, who had clung half-naked to the iron gates at Medina del Campo one stormy November night in 1503, shrieking against the wind until Queen Isabel led her away, who had sat in the open fields night after night with the corpse of her husband. Unhappy Juana, who had inherited an empire only to be locked up for more than half a century in that old castle, whose corridors now echoed to her sobs as she threw herself on her bed, refusing the consolations of religion, or pulled up her gown to show her ulcerated legs to her noble jailer. Charles visited her often. She had had her moments of relief from the curse of her hereditary melancholy. On the day when Philip and Maria called, she seems to have been affable and gracious. She asked them to dance for her, and sat looking on with pleasure while their lithe figures swayed and crossed and circled through the antique hall in some stately pattern of old times. The prince and princess then went to Simancas, whose streets were carpeted with brightly costly cloths wherever they walked, and thence to Valladolid, where the burdens of all Spain were waiting for the young regent's decisions. So much for the most important facts recorded of the first 16 years of the life of the Black Demon of the South. Setting aside all the innumerable conjectures of what he must have been from what he did or was believed to have done at some later time, he seems harmless enough at this period. An erect, shapely, rather majestic young man, made prematurely grave and thoughtful at times, no doubt, by unusual responsibilities, but naturally affable and courteous and fun-loving, frank and affectionate, but already put on his guard by a wise father, and perhaps by some experience, against the wolves and foxes in human form who gathered about a ruler, seeking to control or destroy him, sensitive and highly strung, subject to indigestion, probably irritable and unreasonable at times, but willing to follow the advice or reproof of his confessor, and of Don Juan de Zuniga, lover of birds, especially the nightingale, lover of flowers, especially roses and jonquils, lover of music and sports, who played on the guitar, danced well, sang badly, liked a game of piquet after dinner, hunted with zest, laughed at the antics of dwarfs and buffoons, and of odd people, such as querulous old women, was able to hold up his end in a tournament, lover of painting, and something of a connoisseur, if not a dabbler himself, well instructed in Latin classics, philosophy, history, logic, and modern languages, though slow in the latter, and inclined to be awkward and colloquial in writing his own, deliberate and patient, but extremely determined, and even obstinate when he had made up his mind, a lover of the church and its liturgy, and always respectful to priests and nuns, even when he disliked them. Such was Philip in 1543, according to such contemporary records as remain. The first hint of that dark legend, which for 2 or 3 centuries to come was to frighten little English children in their beds when his name was mentioned, appears in connection with the second great tragedy of his life. The winter of 1543 to 1544 was probably one of his happiest. Wherever he went, he was conscious of the extraordinary devotion of the people, high and low, intensified by a romantic interest in what was believed to be a royal love match. The princess was very popular. Nothing was lacking but an heir to ensure the succession. After Philip and Maria had been married a year, this prayer seemed likely to be granted. All Spain waited eagerly for the royal confinement. It came in the heat of the following July. On the 8th, in the palace where Philip had been born, the little princess gave birth to a son. The boy had a slightly prognathous look, like the Habsburgs, and was named Carlos, after the emperor, whom it was hoped and believed he would succeed and emulate. Don Carlos, custom had inconsistently refused to anglicize his name, so that one speaks of Emperor Charles, but of his grandson Don Carlos. Long live Don Carlos, cried all Spain. Philip's cup seemed full. He sent the good news to the emperor on the 9th, by Ruy Gomez, adding that the princess had stood the ordeal well, but on the 4th day after the birth she died. The rejoicings of the people were turned into mourning. For this misfortune the 16th century Flemish historian Metteren, writing at a time when Philip had many enemies in the Netherlands, blames the Inquisition. Many Lutherans were being burned after an auto de fe that day in Valladolid. According to this account, all the court ladies were so eager to see the heretics roasted that they rushed out of the palace, leaving the poor little princess alone. She took advantage of the opportunity to eat a melon, which caused her death. Major Hume cites another version, omitting, however, the Inquisition. The princess was said to have died from imprudently eating a lemon too soon after her delivery. It is more likely, of course, that puerperal fever had set in, and that neither the melons, the lemons, nor the Lutherans had anything to do with it. The Italian Protestant Leti denies the story of Metteren. There is no record of an auto de fe at Valladolid in 1545. There is, however, a letter of old Secretary Cobos to the Emperor, dated July 16, 1545, whose details sound a little more realistic. On Thursday the 9th, when the prince wrote, he said, both mother and infant were progressing favourably. The princess was somewhat feverish all day Friday, but bright and strong, and all thought her doing well. On Saturday morning the fever increased, with occasional spasms and trembling fits, as the bleeding had ceased. This went on all day. By Saturday evening she was intermittently delirious, and remained so all night. Sunday morning, seeing that the malady had now become so grave as to be almost hopeless, the physicians decided to bleed the patient at the ankle. This was done, and the princess again became conscious and seemed somewhat better. The improvement, however, lasted but a very short time, and the attack became so severe that in a few hours extreme unction was administered at the princess's request. The attack still increased until God took her to himself on that day between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, amidst universal grief, such as your majesty may imagine. Her end was tranquil and Christian, and she left a will and codicil made before her illness. The prince was extremely grieved, as to prove that he loved her, although judging by outward demonstration, some people thought differently. He had once decided to go to the same night to the monastery of Abrotho, where there was a fairly good lodging for him in the house they had repaired. He was so sad that he will allow no one else to visit or see him. The Comendador Mayor of Castile, Don Antonio de Rojas, and Don Alvaro de Cordoba are with him. The prince, being in this trouble, has written to your majesty briefly, but sent for me, and directed me verbally to send your majesty all the details. Philip remained in the monastery for several days. Then he returned to Valladolid, the cares of state, and small Don Carlos.